Brenda K. Powell had lived in the picturesque town of Akron, Ohio since she was a teenager. After having graduated from the University of Akron, she had dedicated her life as a child life specialist at the local children's hospital. She was devoted to her job and by 2020 had worked at the hospital for 28 years. Brenda was a good wife to her husband Stephen and a loving mother to their two children, Andrew and Sydney. The family were close-knit and the Powell children were academically gifted, on par for bright and successful futures. Sydney in particular had a track record of high grades throughout her time at St. Vincent St. Mary High School. She was heavily involved with extracurricular programs such as Girl Scouts, dance classes and soccer, and was able to maintain her high grade point average. Naturally, her parents were very proud. When the time finally came for Sydney to select a college, the family decided together that she would attend the University of Mount Union. This university had a small campus and would also allow Sydney to remain close by to her family, with the university located just an hour's drive from her parents' home. Even more so, Sydney had won a presidential scholarship which partially funded her tuition. This had greatly eased the financial strain on her parents. She would begin classes in September of 2018. Brenda and her daughter had been especially close to one another, something which was noted by all of those around them. As this was Sydney's first time away on her own, the family used the Life 360 app, an app that allowed Brenda and Stephen to monitor and track Sydney's location at all times. Mount Union themselves also had an app that allowed users to review a student's progress throughout their time at college, but Brenda and Stephen rarely used this. They did not want to invade Sydney's privacy and trusted that her exceptional grades would continue. When Sydney came home for the summer in 2019, she did not discuss her performance at college and remained vague to any questions regarding how she was finding college life. In hindsight, she was struggling with her course and her grades had begun to reflect this, but this was something she was determined to keep from her family. After a life of academic success and high grades, she was ashamed at how she was failing and didn't want to let her parents down. Sydney returned to campus that fall, but her troubles were about to get even worse. By the end of the year, Sydney had received written notice of her expulsion after she had failed 3 out of her 4 classes. She was no longer a student at the university. Despite this, she returned home for the holidays as though nothing was wrong, spending Christmas and New Year with her family. In January of 2020, Sydney went back to Mount Union, returning to her dorm room and keeping up the false pretenses to her roommate Lauren. Soon enough, a Mount Union University administrator, Michelle Gaffney, contacted Sydney to inform her that she was no longer allowed onto the dorms. Michelle also informed Sydney that her campus keycard would soon be terminated. Sydney tried to argue that she was still a student, but after being confronted about having signed the suspension letter to confirm that she understood that she would be unenrolled from her studies, Sydney admitted that she knew she was no longer a student, but was hoping she could get this changed. The school administrators offered to contact Sydney's parents to explain the situation to them, but Sydney became distressed, insisting that she had already told them. This was a lie. Sydney agreed to leave the dorms, telling her roommate that she was going away for a little while, but still not disclosing that she had been kicked out. By February of 2020, Sydney was paying cash to stay in hotels to keep up the bravado that she was still attending college. Despite going through great lengths to disguise her academic situation, on the 25th of February 2020, Brenda sent a text message to her daughter that read, "Why do I always feel like you're scamming me? Just remember, you need to keep the grades to keep your scholarship." Sydney rudely responded, "My grades are good, thank you very much." Brenda's momentary suspicions were raised further when Stephen had tried to log into the university portal to pay a check on Sydney's tuition, but strangely, the website kicked him out and he was denied access. Stephen asked his daughter why the portal wasn't working, and she replied that it was just a website glitch, but that she would look into it for him. She had always been a trustworthy child, so he had no reason not to believe his daughter. On the 3rd of March 2020, Stephen unexpectedly received an urgent phone call whilst at work from Mount Union University officials who informed him that Sydney was no longer enrolled at their university. When he asked how long this had been the case, they responded, "You'll have to ask her." Stephen was shocked that Sydney had been lying about attending college whilst he had been writing checks to pay for it. After checking the Life 360 app to see where his daughter was, he could see that Sydney was at home. He immediately left work and headed home to confront his daughter. Upon questioning by her father, Sydney told him that she was having a little trouble on her course, but she was still attending classes with her roommate. Believing Sydney's lies, Stephen encouraged her to go through the semester and reassured her that she could take the summer off if she needed to, and that they would work through it together. Sydney got emotional and told her father how her friends had things figured out, but she didn't. Stephen then suggested that they call Brenda to come home from work and talk to Sydney. Brenda was an empathetic woman who knew how to calm people in emotional or stressful situations. She had to do the same thing when dealing with her cancer patients. Upon hearing that her daughter was distressed, Brenda left work and began to make her way home. Stephen made the fatal decision to head back to work before Brenda arrived. Over the next hour, Brenda and Stephen kept in touch over text, and at 12:41 p.m, Stephen sent one final text message which read, "What did you discuss with Sydney?" But Brenda never replied. Earlier that afternoon, Brenda had contacted Mount Union University and left a message asking to discuss Sydney's situation. When college administrators Michelle Gaffney and Dean Frazier had arrived back to the office, Dean Frazier had returned the call. At 12:36 p.m, Brenda had picked up the phone, and as Dean was introducing himself, he was alarmed to hear a blood-curdling scream, followed by an extremely loud thud. Michelle, who was sitting near to Dean at their desk, then heard an expulsion of air, like the air was knocked out of somebody. This was then followed by several more repeated thuds and continual screaming. As Dean and Michelle called out to Brenda asking if she was okay, the phone line cut out. They immediately called back but received no answer. On the third attempt, just 3.5 minutes later, somebody finally picked up the phone. Dean frantically asked, "Brenda, is that you? Are you there?" A voice responded, "Yes, this is Brenda." But the voice on the other end of the phone was not that of the lady he had been speaking to just minutes before. The voice was one in which Michelle Gaffney recognised instantly. It was Sydney Powell. Dean replied to the voice, "Sydney, I think this is you. This is not Brenda." The line instantly went dead. Disturbed by what had just occurred, Dean and Michelle called the Akron State Police and asked for a welfare check on Brenda Powell. Stephen, who had now arrived back at work, soon received a call from a police friend who informed him that there was a disturbance at his home. He called the family home and spoke to Sydney, who became hysterical when she heard that police were on the way. Meanwhile, Sydney got to work staging the crime scene, breaking a window to make it look as though there had been a break-in to align with the story that she would go on to tell police. That there had been a break-in and her mother had told her to flee the house. When investigators arrived to the scene, however, they noted blood on the outside of the door frame, meaning that the window must have been broken after Brenda had been attacked. Sydney was found by police at the end of her driveway. Her eyes were rolled back and she continuously scratched the ground until her fingers started to bleed. This hysteria soon died down. She entered a catatonic state, lying on the ground in a fetal position, as the enormity of what she had done hit her. The police found Brenda inside the home with life-threatening cuts and wounds, lying in a pool of her own blood in the master bedroom. She had been struck many times with a cast-iron frying pan and then stabbed repeatedly with a steak knife. The kitchen tools once used by Brenda to cook family meals had been weaponized against her and now laid beside her on the floor. Sadly, Brenda would pass away due to her injuries not long after. A forensic pathologist would conclude that she had died as a result of multiple blows to the head, followed by 23 stab wounds to her neck with a steak knife. Brenda's arms and hands had defensive wounds, indicating that she had tried to defend herself during the attack. Sydney was promptly arrested and charged with her mother's murder, felonious assault, and tampering with evidence. Stephen, who was desperate to keep his family together, begged for his daughter's charges to be dropped, stating that Brenda wouldn't want her daughter to be punished. Sydney's attorney argued that Sydney had mental health issues. During a psychiatric examination, Sydney stated that she had only remembered her mother sitting on the couch comforting her, and that she did not remember anything after that. 3 psychologists examined Sydney and concluded that she was schizophrenic, arguing that Sydney killed her mother whilst in the middle of a psychotic break. But the prosecution pointed out that Sydney's staging of the scene meant that she was mentally fit and was well aware of what she was doing. In September of 2023, Sydney, who was now 23 years old, pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. The jury, however, found her guilty of her mother's murder and the other charges against her. Sydney was sentenced to life behind bars with a minimum of 15 years. The child patients at Akron Children's Hospital were also heavily affected by Brenda's murder, as Brenda had been like a mother to them and helped to nurse them through their treatment. The entire case could have been avoided if only Sydney had accepted her failures and opened up to her parents, who more than likely would have been there for their daughter and helped her to find her way.